I started the Real Mental podcast because it bugs me when film and TV miss the mark about how mental health gets portrayed. Real Mental is a podcast where a film loving psychiatrist, that's me, talks to directors, writers, actors, and critics to help people figure out their life by getting to the truth about mental health in the movies. Welcome, Jason Anderson, to the Real Mental podcast.
Great. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, I'm very happy to have you here today to talk about Sentimental Value, which I think is such an interesting film. It actually was the first film I saw at TIFF this year, so it really started me off on a good note. But before we do that, why don't you remind the listeners a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Terrific. Great. And yes, my name is Jason Anderson, and I've been a film critic and journalist in Toronto for a long time. But in recent years, I've been making more of my living, more of my activity as a film programmer, including for TIFF. I'm now the lead programmer for Canada for TIFF, but I also program films from the Nordic and Benelux regions. And I work for a variety of other festivals in the US and Asia and Canada, and it's a great way to see a lot of films all year round, which I can't complain about, but it does scramble your brains.
I know. I was just telling somebody yesterday that I have a little trick now where I just write myself a little review script right after every film, like a 1 minute review, just to keep it in my head. And that seems to make sure that things stay clear in my brain. But we have to have hacks, right? Otherwise,
Oh yeah.
it's hard to remember. But this film I definitely remember because, like I said, it's the first film I saw at TIFF and it really made a huge impression. So before I say anything, why don't you tell the listeners what you thought about this film and how it affected you?
Terrific. Yeah, and this was a film I'd been looking forward to for a good while. I mean, this is by the director Joachim Trier, who is actually, I realize he's Norwegian, he identifies Norwegian, but he's also got quite a bit of Danish heritage. But he's made a lot of great films in Norway, often centered on Oslo, which is sort of the city that stars in a lot of his movies. But yeah, Joachim Trier, his relationship with TIFF goes all the way back to his first film, which won the Discovery First Film Prize at TIFF back in 2006. It was an amazing movie called Reprise that I think has really kind of launched him in a really positive way, but also kind of introduces a lot of his style, I think, in a way that sort of carries through to all the way up to Sentimental Value, which is, I think, really just such a mature, accomplished, impeccably made movie that I think as soon as it sort of arrived on the scene at Cannes, and then I was there when it premiered at Cannes, it had this, I mean, one thing that always amuses me about Cannes is people get obsessed with like how long the standing ovation lasts. And I believe that people actually do have the stopwatches running in the theater. Like, how long is this one going to go? And it's really like a very strange barometer because there's plenty of films that maybe aren't that great, but have like a very warm room full of friends eager to defend and celebrate or whatever else. They'll go on for a while. But anyway, this was, I think, the longest one in a while, at least since I can remember. It was 19 minutes of applause, which is, I think, you could tell on the faces of the actors and Joachim Trier was too long, just too long to be standing there absorbing applause because it really is like, it's already, if you're a relatively shy, introverted artist like Trier, to stand there, and absorb appreciation for that long is I'm sure, quite nerve wracking. but but it was a great reception there. It went on to win the grand prize, which is the sort of second place prize from the jury. It was very ecstatically received, and I think it's been, clear that this is going to be one of the sort of front runners, certainly amongst the sort of international films for awards season. It's had this sort of ecstatic reception at all the festivals since, and I think a real validation for Joachim Trier. I mean, this is a film that he sort of had his sort of bigger international breakthrough. His last feature, which was The Worst Person in the World, which is really, again, a really lovely, quite different film, but definitely showcases many of his strengths and also introduced sort of a wider audience to one of the film stars who was going to return for Sentimental Value, who was the Norwegian actress Renate Reinsve, who was extraordinary here as well. But yeah, certainly it's a film about family and memory and history and making art and making sacrifices. And I think it's really an ensemble piece with a, kind of real range of great performances in it and all kinds of really richly explored themes. So I think it's really something I can imagine continuing to do very well with audiences, especially as it heads into sort of regular release in the upcoming weeks and months.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things I thought was so interesting about this film is it's about a father who's a film director and his two daughters, adult daughters, one of whom, Nora, is a working actor, and his daughter Agnes, who's the older one, was the star of one of his early films, and it was a very, very successful film, but then she stopped acting. And it's a very interesting film because this man is estranged from his children and was divorced from his wife, and the relationship is so difficult, and he's trying to use art to reconnect, especially with Nora, his younger daughter. And I think that was such a lovely theme to explore in film.
Yeah, and very much. Definitely, we making movies about making movies is certainly a thing we've seen in many past films. But I mean, I think it's just really about the toll of making art and being a creative person is certainly a strong theme in the film, and what it means to kind of make the sacrifices necessary or you think are necessary to your creative work and how that impacts families. And I think that's something quite resonant, especially when it comes to that relationship between Gustav and his daughters, kind of one of whom is a creative. Nora, played by Renata Reinsve, is a stage actress, and she kind of gets the first big moment in the film, too, as a sort of someone freaking out before having to go make her entrance on stage. And you can see how much that, creative life has sort of impacted her. And then with Agnes, the other daughter, played by Inga Ipsdotter Lilias, as a quiet, and she's sort of forsaken the artistic life. She's not involved with that at all. And I think one thing that's really telling, and something I've seen, certainly about, artists and especially filmmakers, people who've involved their children in their art making, is you can see that like he's kind of only really maybe been a father when it sort of intersected with his filmmaking, especially when it comes to Agnes, who you see as there's a film clip of Agnes as a child in sort of one of Gustav's most famous films, and there is this sense that maybe he really only kind of was a father to Agnes when she was his actress as a child, and that's really kind of the loss that the two women feel about their father, is that he hasn't really seen them unless he's sort of seen them through the lens of his work, which is really at the center of his life.
Yeah. And then, of course, he wants his daughter Nora to be in his next film, and she's not having any of it.
Nope,
And then he wants his grandson, Agnes's child, to also be in the film, and she's not having any of it.
nope.
And it's so, so interesting how things unfold in terms of, family versus art, for example, right? Like which is going to win, and can there be a way to compromise and have both?
Right. I mean, certainly you could see from the kind of immense hostility that the daughters, that Nora and Agnes express to these ideas. I mean, they know what the cost is. They're very aware of, how much they did or didn't matter to their father, and the idea that he has come at this point to potentially make amends. And that's something I think is very what Gustav is doing, because what he's done is written to the script that really explores, I think, the kind of the key family trauma, which really happened a generation before Gustav. Even this is something that I think Gustav is. I think initially the film kind of maybe has a little bit more of a sort of potentially cynical take on Gustav and his motivations, to sort of like, oh, he's this selfish artist who's kind of trying to kind of have this, sees a means of sort of trying to get back in the game because he's a bit washed up, a bit of a has-been, and that he maybe sort of kind of cotton on to, sort of use his daughters, use Nora, who has some, prestige, to get back to make another film. But you realize that really that what's in that script is actually very powerful and very much key to this family history in a way that is not exploitative. It's very sincere, even if Gustav does not seem like the most sincere of people.
Yeah, yeah. Despite himself, he has written a script that's very vulnerable and revealing, and also like a way of reaching out to his children to sort of say, look, I have trauma because of these things that happened in the past, and that might maybe not justify, but explain to you why I have been an absent father or a father who didn't know how to give you love, because I had my own issues. And I think when the daughters finally see that, they have some kind of an understanding of him at least.
Yeah, I think it's very surprising because I think you expect a certain kind of selfish artist figure from Stellan Skarsgård's character, and he does sort of set up as a bit of a pompous windbag. as, and there's things that he does throughout the film that make you feel like, oh, maybe he's being opportunistic, he's being solipsistic. But gradually, I mean, the film does such a beautiful job of sort of unpacking those behaviors and revealing more about the context and how much it's really got to do with, kind of there is an intertwining of sort of art and life, and stuff that has happened in this family from very, very early on. I mean, there's a long historical lineage happening, and the film plays with that continually. Like, it certainly, especially in these amazing early scene, very early in the film, which sort of tracks the history of this family and this house. And the house is really this sort of central thing, this extraordinary house that, kind of maybe as the title is most about this sort of the idea of the sentimental value of this space that has been in this family for a long time, and that the daughters especially have to figure out what to do with, because their mother has died and their mother has been long separated from Gustav, but because there's this fate around the house that is unclear, everyone has to start to grapple with this history they do know, history they don't know, because the house has sort of compelled them.
Yeah. And I want to take a little sidestep here because in the middle of this story, when the daughters are both pushing back really hard, Borg makes a sidestep himself and gets in this American actress played by Elle Fanning. Her name is Rachel Kemp. And he gets her to be the star of his film because he's figuring, I still want to make my film. And Rachel, her character is so emotionally astute that she has this growing realization that she is not the person to play this role. She's the wrong actress. It shouldn't be in English. It shouldn't be her. And even though she loves the opportunity, she makes a sacrifice, not for art, well, maybe for his art, not for her art. She makes the sacrifice and takes herself out of the running because she knows that this is not her role to play. She's not part of that family and she shouldn't be part of the film. And I thought that was so interesting a choice. What did you make of that?
Yeah, again, like, it's such a nice, surprising thing, because I think the film does that all the way through. It sort of introduces, kind of characters or ideas that you think are familiar. They're sort of familiar tropes. And Rachel Kemp, Elle Fanning's character, is one of them. You just think, oh, this is sort of a sort of potentially vacuous American celebrity star who, kind of doesn't really know much about Gustav's work, but they connect, or she gets to see some of his films. Actually, she sees the film starring Agnes, which they're playing at the Deauville Film Festival, which is a real film festival in France. They're there together, and she's just so moved and so kind of dumbstruck or awestruck by his work that she's like, I want to work with you. This is the best thing, I've seen for however long it touched her. So anyway, this is, and I think that that's sort of a thing where you think, okay, well, Gustav's going to get his break, and he gets his Netflix deal based on the participation of Rachel Kemp in this movie. But I mean, it really, again, like, it does sort of kind of move against these expectations about what this is going to mean, and gradually as they get deeper in, and Rachel is very astute about kind of what the personal significance is, and kind of probably why his work was resonant, why the film with Agnes as a child was so resonant, why the stuff that is most potent in his art is really the stuff that is sort of most personal, and that this film is having to change because of Rachel Kemp and because of Netflix and because of kind of having it in English, because she doesn't speak the Norwegian, although I think he's actually supposed to be sort of Swedish and Norwegian in the film too. But certainly there's stuff that is changing about the film, the project, because of the commercial concerns. And that is stuff that she realizes, this isn't about me. This can't be about me. This is something that has to be kind of within the family fold. And this is, it wasn't just, why Gustav approached Nora about the script originally, is because it had to be with Nora. It has to stay within the family. And that's something that she recognizes and is something surprising, because you realize, oh, this Rachel Kemp has some depth. She's not, she understands the score better than Gustav does, for instance.
Yeah, she's more emotionally intelligent than people give her credit for. And I think that was a wonderful little aha from the movie, that just because someone is a movie star doesn't mean they're not an artist.
Yeah, and that's tough, because you realize that they are not good for this thing. That whatever is most special about this script is something that's being lost because of her influence and because of her celebrity, but every these other things. So she has to step away.
Yeah, it was really, really interesting. There's another piece of sort of technical something or other, I don't know what to call it, in the film where the director takes art and life, and you can't quite tell in the film if this is a scene from the character's life or is this the scene that the character is acting on stage or on screen or in rehearsal. And he does it a few times, right, Von Trier? You see this thing happening and you're not sure if the person is actually crying, and then you see, oh no, it's a rehearsal, or like,
Yeah.
it's so interesting that he keeps repeating that. Why do you think he's doing that? Because I found that so fascinating.
And now, let's pause for a quick word about my other podcast. I'm Dr. Marcia Sirota. We all need to be inspired and uplifted these days. We need a good laugh and we need to be moved. In the Ruthless Compassion podcast, I speak with a wonderfully diverse group of people. They've overcome daunting obstacles and they're making unique, exciting contributions to our communities and to our world. The Ruthless Compassion podcast has created more than 175 episodes over the past several years. Why not have a listen to it today?
It's funny. I mean, certainly, you think about lots of amazing films about the film business. I mean, I was just thinking about Francois Truffaut's Day for Night is a big sort of piece of this for sure. Like this idea, like who are actors, who are sort of filmmakers, and the sort of the melding of life and art, which is, and again, very, very much key to a lot of sort of later Ingmar Bergman is a big part of this too. And certainly was somebody, another filmmaker who used sort of people close in his life, romantic partners, if other people, and there was that sort of blurring of what is happening on stage or in front of the camera versus what's supposed to be the ostensible realistic or naturalistic context for a story. I mean, of course, it's all kind of like that anyway. I mean, this is a narrative film, so all of this is sort of fabricated to some degree. But I think there's certainly maybe, say, a playfulness about this sort of intermingling of what's supposed to be immediately on stage, immediately part of a performance versus what's not. And I think Trier is really getting at that thing that, I mean, they're kind of both true. I think that's sort of like one of the things that there's nothing like the idea that there's a falseness necessarily about Nora when she's on stage versus not on stage. I think that line between the two is very thin for a lot of performers. That then there's certainly a lot of things that they're happening for them, you know, things that they are able to access more easily on stage than they can in their real lives too. I mean, that's, I think, a sort of part of the sort of conflict for Nora is that she's really struggling with her emotions. And there's certainly a mental health struggle for her. And I think that there's stuff that she, kind of has to deal with on stage that is important to the rest of her personality. And I think that's something that clear with Gustav and how he sort of regards, stuff that he's dealing with. And in fact, kind of one of the key things is, that Gustav is really sort of trying to grapple with his mother's suicide, which is something that definitely is sort of restaged. And I think that that's kind of key for him to kind of transform maybe a lot of the most difficult things in his history into something that can be performed because it is a way of understanding it. I think that's something that the film isn't just sort of intermingling the sort of performed and ostensibly real as a sort of matter of trickery. I think it's part of the sort of processing that characters are going through, that they sort of have to kind of inhabit emotions. And I think for a lot of performers to do that on stage is a safer space to do it than it is off stage. I think that's sort of clear for Nora, especially the stuff that she's able to access and deal with emotionally within a character space that becomes much more, potentially dangerous or destructive or just damaging when she's doing it beyond that space.
Yeah. And, when you say that, it makes me think that one of the themes of the films is how art can be used as a way to distance, and certainly in the early part of his career, Gustav was not connected to his children and not connected to his family. And his art was a way of almost separating himself from the family. And then in the end of the film, art was really used as a way to connect and to process trauma and to work through relationships and to unify and unite. And so it's two ways of looking at how we can experience art, how we can use art, how we can perform art, right? We can use it to distance ourselves or we can use it to really deepen our experiences.
Yeah, I think it's very clear. I think that's a really good way to put it too about that sort of transition we see over the course of the film, because you really do start from a place where our understanding of Gustav and his art, his relationship to his creativity, his work has been very damaging to this family. That he has ostensibly no relationships with his adult daughters, and they are very suspicious of him and very cynical about him because they have been hurt by him before and tried to have this relationship, and that they realized that they were never going to be first for him and that they're angry at him and for all good reasons. I think part of that is to sort of see how, and you can see that Nora is a successful artist, that she's a successful actress, but she's also maybe sort of found, maybe intuitively, a way to sort of deal with some of this damage herself, but she still has struggles. But the emotional journey and the emotional realizations these characters have as they sort of get towards the end and realize what kind of, what opportunity they have. And there's another significant key scene that I think is something that really, especially seeing the film the second time, realized just how important, in hearing from Joachim Trier's talking about the film, the scene where Agnes goes to the archive to really kind of look at and get into more about what their grandmother is someone who was involved with the resistance in Norway during the war, during Norway's occupation by the Nazis. And that is the historical trauma at the heart of the film too. I mean, hopefully people can, kind of, maybe if they're not really encountering that subject, especially in recent years in Norwegian cinema, big subject. I mean, thinking about the impacts of what the sort of the persecution and the imprisonment and the torture and the murder of a lot of people who resisted the Nazi occupation of Norway during the war. And that's something Trier himself has talked about, the impact on his family, because his grandfather, who was a musician and an artist and a filmmaker, but had a similar sort of ordeal during the war. And, there's a legacy that so many families in Norway have had to sort of cope with. And that's sort of something that I think that for Agnes's character, for her to kind of come to an understanding of like what that was in her family, what that history was, and how that impacted her grandmother, who she never knew, and how that carried through in her father and the choices he made and the person he became, and how that affected her and her own family, and her sister and herself. I mean, that's so elegantly done. And then, not without really kind of necessarily, I mean, Trier doesn't really like spell that out in a really obvious way, but really that does become a big core of the film, is sort of like what the sort of historical trauma has been in this family and many families like it, and that, this is how that has affected behavior for generations.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because I was thinking about that, this intergenerational trauma and this trauma that's passed from grandma to dad to daughters, and how Agnes is so fiercely protective of her son and sort of saying, the buck stops here, you're not getting the impact of this trauma, I'm going to protect you from it. And she's so fiercely protective, and there's a very good reason. And also, it makes it very clear why Rachel, the character, would opt out of the film, because she's not involved in this intergenerational trauma. She has nothing to do with it, and she's a fish out of water. She doesn't belong. Whereas everyone else is very much implicated in this very tragic history of what happened to the grandmother and how she couldn't process her own trauma. It was just too much for her. And then her son, also Gustav, couldn't really process it as a person in relationship. He was able to, have a wife and have a family and have a career, but he wasn't really able to connect until much later in his life when he started to face his trauma. So I think this film is, as a psychotherapist, as a psychiatrist, is such a good film because it's really saying you have to face your trauma. Even if you are on some level successful, you're not really going to be a full, whole human being until you deal with your trauma whatever way you need to. In his way, it's through his art, but whatever way you need to, because you can't be whole otherwise, right? And you're going to just keep passing on the pain.
Yeah, and that's something too. Like, I think it's sort of interesting because, I mean, you think about ideas about trauma and intergenerational trauma, and I think people may be surprised to see when people are ostensibly successful and what they carry, and and you think about what the drives that would have, what would have created sort of an artistic drive for Gustav, and then what Nora inherited from that, and how actually, in many regards, very successful, well motivated, certainly, but the personal cost to them has been, obviously very strong. I mean, Gustav obviously has been, not really been the best father, and certainly wasn't a great husband. And Nora, you see that reflected in her relationship, which is actually interesting because she has a lover who's another actor in the company, who's played by Anders Danielsen Lee, who's this fantastic actor who's been, I think he's been in, I think, every one of Trier's films, and is actually was sort of one of the romantic partners for Renata Reinsve in The Worst Person in the World. And you can see that relationship, because he's married and they're kind of having something going on the sly, and that he's kind of like, I'm not part of this anymore. You can see that this is not the first time she's had this kind of relationship. And she's had very, obviously, maybe some poor modeling when it comes to romantic relationships from her father, and his sort of unable to break that, or no really recognize that it is even a thing that she needs to break. So I mean, there really is such a sophisticated writing and sort of showing the sort of patterns without, again, being super obvious. Like she's in many ways very different from her father, but there's certainly things that, there's behaviors that she's unable to break apart, and that, for these people to have any kind of emotional advance and begin rebuilding a relationship, they kind of have to see each other, and that's something that's really, I think, very beautifully expressed in many, whether it's the sisters to each other, and of course seeing their father. People are seeing each other for the first time in their adult lives in many regards.
Yeah, and what you said is so accurate, how he's able to express these very complicated, complex, subtle psychological concepts, like the way that trauma makes you reenact certain kinds of patterns, or how a disrupted attachment to your father can create disrupted attachments to your partners or potential partners. And Trier is expressing these very complicated topics in psychology, but in such a simple and direct way that we're just observing it and understanding it without a lot of exposition or explanation. And I think that's quite masterful.
And I think something actually quite new for Joachim Trier, because I mean, he's made a bunch of terrific films, and I think the people, especially audiences at TIFF, have had the chance to see over the years. And then there's some really, really thoughtful, very sweet. I think a second film, Oslo, August 31st. That's the title, and that stars Anders Danielsen Lee as a recovering drug addict. And a very thoughtful film that one was too. But I think this one, I mean, of all those films, this I think is the most sincere one that he's done. And he's talked a bit about that too, about how, I mean, he was a sort of 80s, 90s kid who had a sort of ironic detachment to a lot of things, or a way of sort of dealing things. But this is, I think, the most sincere film he's made. And to that, maybe, some people I think I've talked to kind of prefer, maybe there's certainly a greater sort of spontaneity, or wildness in like The Worst Person in the World that is not so much here. Like that one definitely has a different energy, a younger energy. This is sort of, I think this is a mature, it's very, very thoughtful and very sort of empathetic in regards to sort of some of the things that maybe people start to hopefully figure out later in their lives, And ultimately for a figure like Gustav, who I think in another film may have been more a figure of, just ridicule or a lack of sympathy. I mean, the film ultimately sort of brings you into sort of feeling like, oh, this is a very complex person who's, we're not out to forgive him for his kind of bad parenting and selfishness, but, to sort of see him as a complete person. I think that's, again, a very mature piece of writing to be able to sort of do that.
Yeah, one thing I really have a problem with in certain films is that they make characters very one dimensional, especially if they have some kind of psychological issue. So they're only that thing. And what you just said reminds me of how much I appreciated this film, because all the characters were multifaceted. They weren't just one thing. Even Agnes, the sweet, quiet daughter, was very fierce as a mom and very
Mm-hmm.
smart as a researcher. So she had lots of different aspects. Nora, the actress, who is brilliantly talented and yet completely ambivalent about her performing, terrified to go on stage, and then fabulous at it, and then so full of rage and hurt. So they're all the characters, and even the character of Rachel, the actress, she's not the person that you expect, as you were saying. She's much deeper and smarter and wiser and more sensitive and more willing to sacrifice than one would expect from this pretty blonde, superstar movie star. So all the characters were very, very rich and well-rounded, and I think that made me appreciate the film so much more, and it was so much more psychologically accurate.
Yeah, well, it's great to hear. It's sort of like from your position, perspective. Because I said, like, if it feels right, like I think sort of like it's unusual to have a film that actually has this kind of ambition, but also that the behaviors sort of line up so well with sort of the thematic and also historical. Like there's definitely a layering here, and yet it doesn't feel like it feels very organic, and it feels like the actors are really kind of, and the characters are arriving where they need to arrive at in a very uncontrived way.
Yeah. When is the film coming out in North America?
I believe late November. You can verify. It's definitely something that's going to be getting a big push. The distributor of the film, Neon, has backed some of the sort of most honored and decorated films of recent years. And I know that this is something that is, I think, every year, certainly nowadays, it's not so unusual for films that are not in English to figure well at the Oscars, for instance. But I think this is certainly the one of the films that will be, getting out of the international feature category into other places and other categories and such, because it really is kind of across the board a really, really strong film. And I think that there's not really much like it, especially, I think things that have a kind of emotional, vulnerability and tenderness, but also with a lot of warmth and wit too.
Yeah, the very first scene was funny. And, you talk about not having a lot of wildness. That was wild, that first scene.
Oh
That
yeah,
was pretty wild. So it started with a bang for sure.
yeah. And there is. I mean, that's it. Like the film does have a lot of this sort of a big energy at times too. I mean, it doesn't have as much running as Worst Person in the World, which has a lot of running. This one is less running, I think, as a film.
Well, Jason Anderson, thank you so much for coming on the Real Mental podcast to talk about Sentimental Value. This is such a wonderful film and such a great discussion today. So thank you for doing it.
Thanks so much. Really happy to.
This is Dr. Marcia Sirota. Thanks for listening to the Real Mental podcast. Please leave a review and your comments wherever you listen to podcasts. And don't forget to sign up for my free newsletter at marciasirotamd.com. And while you're at it, why not check out my Ruthless Compassion podcast with over 180 episodes and counting? If you have any ideas for guests for either Real Mental or Ruthless Compassion podcasts, please email us at info@marciasirotamd.com. Happy listening!